Why are we making you read this short essay by Andy Matuschak? Why books don't work. Let me see if I can explain. On the slide is a quote about the experience and utility of reading books for knowledge. Read it. Read it as I read it along. I put on the garments of court and palace, step inside the venerable courts of the ancients, where, solicitously received by them, I nourish myself on that food that alone is mine and for which I was born, where I am unashamed to converse with them and to question them about the motives for their actions. And they, out of their human kindness, answer me. And for 4 hours at a time I feel no boredom, I forget all my troubles, I do not dread poverty, and I am not terrified by death. This was written in the early 1500s by intellectual bureaucrat and statesman Niccolo Machiavelli of the Republic of Florence, Italy. For Machiavelli, indeed, a book was almost as good as being there with the author. Indeed, books are better, because Machiavelli in his library had many authors, all at his beck and call, and he would go into his library, and there he would read, and in his mind's eye as he read, he would converse with the authors. He would question them, and they, out of their human kindness, would answer him. Here is another quote. This one was written down in the early -300s by the philosopher Plato, of the city of Athens in Greece. He was reporting or claiming to report the words of his teacher Socrates. Socrates said, according to Plato, "The creations of a painter have the attitude of life, and yet if you ask them a question, they preserve a solemn silence. Words once written down, they are tumbled about anywhere among those who may or may not understand them, and they know not to whom they should reply, to whom not, and they cannot protect or defend themselves. Would a husbandman take the seeds and in sober earnest plant them there during the heat of summer? The serious pursuit of the dialectician, finding a congenial soul, by the help of science, sows and plants therein words that are able to help themselves, and have them a seed which others brought up in different soils render immortal, making the possessors of it happy, to the utmost extent of human happiness." Socrates is here writing in striking contrast with Machiavelli. Socrates appears to think that books are very likely by themselves to be misread and misinterpreted. They cannot defend themselves. They do not know to whom they should reply, to whom not. Socrates, at least as portrayed by Plato, has a diametrically opposed view of the usefulness of books. While for Machiavelli, books allow him to talk to people long dead, much wiser than himself, and many of them, for Socrates, a book is like just staring at a picture of someone who cannot answer and talk back. For Socrates, real education is only conducted by a teacher, quote, skilled in the art of dialectic, unquote, of getting a true dialogue going that leads the student to think for themselves, and thus to plant in their brain, quote, words which are able to help themselves, which will then make the possessors happy to the utmost extent of human happiness. Machiavelli, by contrast, thinks that education is accomplished best by simply throwing somebody with the leisure time to read into a library. Now, for most people, most of the time, for most people, all of the time, I'd say. For some people, most of the time, and for all people, at least some of the time, Socrates was right. It is very hard work to learn anything but the most partial and evanescent knowledge from books. A book, for most of us, does not trigger a fantasy, almost a hallucination, that we are engaging with another mind, arguing and discussing with the author, and does not engrave itself upon the bioelectroneurochemistry of our brains, in the same way that a conversation or a debate does. So when we here in the university assign you books to read, we pose you a difficult task. We want you to get something out of these books that we assign. And indeed, the point of Andy Matuschak's essay is that he reads a lot and finds that over and over again he fails to get much of anything out of the books he reads. So the question, how are you to duplicate, as you read, the active learning components of education that an in-person university with classes and discussions does largely as a matter of course in its daily dialogues, and that truly skilled active readers like Machiavelli did whenever they entered into their libraries, and thus began a dialogue with, say, the then 1500 years dead Roman historian Titus Livius. That, Machiavelli looks at these black marks on a white page, and from them he spins up a subterranean instantiation of the mind of Titus Livius, and he then runs that mind on his own wetware and argues with it. About a decade ago, there was great enthusiasm for MOOCs, massively online something courses, massively open online courses, as a way that, as MOOC enthusiast Sebastian Thrum then put it, he could teach tens of thousands of students worldwide rather than mere hundreds. But MOOCs did not cut it. It turned out, you see, that the people who could learn from MOOCs were the Machiavellis. They were the people who could turn the books in front of their eyes into subterranean instantiations of the minds of the book's authors and have deep conversations with them. Quote, I'm unashamed to converse with them and to question them about the motives for their actions, and they, out of their human kindness, They answer, said Machiavelli. And indeed, I remember my wife saying when I was younger that I was the only person who talked to his thesis advisor in the shower often and found himself answering him. Contrast Socrates' students, for whom the words on the page are like the creations of the painter with the attitude of life, and yet if you ask them a question, they preserve a solemn silence. You would imagine that they had intelligence, but they do not. And one peculiar thing is we only know Socrates said this because Plato wrote it down in a book. And there are complicated questions about Plato and philosophy embedded in there. MOOCs, you see, turned out to be very much like books. For those who could learn effectively from them, they were fine, but they were also only a little better than and a lot more expensive than a book. For those who could not actively read books to get deep and durable learning out of them, we found out that very few of them could take MOOCs and do much better. So we need a plan. For those of you, which is almost all of us, who are not Machiavellis all the time, or even much of the time, and none of us are Machiavellis all the time, but rather much more like Socrates' student, the hapless Glaucon. People who really need a tutorial from a professor, a GSI, a roommate, a classmate, a study group, etc. Now, in the in-person university, such tutorials are easy or at least straightforward to find, or at least happen by accident with considerable frequency, and the university has been designed, although not entirely consciously, to maximize those kinds of encounters. And when we have them, they work quite well. But is that simply enough? We also have books, and we want you to get stuff out of not just lunchroom conversations and late-night BS sessions and lectures and discussions and sections. We want you to get a lot out of the books we make you read as well, which means you have to turn yourself into Machiavelli, and that's a difficult task indeed. And here, I have a problem as I try to guide you into reading actively, because in a very profound sense, I am the wrong person to be your guide. You need to figure out and then emulate what Machiavelli is doing. You'll figure out why the books answer to Niccolo Machiavelli. Why Niccolo has this near hallucination of a dialogue, a fantasy. But Socrates, a student, Glaucon does not. The letters just simply sit there on the page. And we professors here at Berkeley, you see, are genuinely world class at doing what Machiavelli does. If it were not so, we would not be here doing what we do, holding the jobs that we have. We are very, very good at learning from books curled up with a chair and retaining that learning. We are very good in sitting in front of the screens, issuing commands and looking at the numbers that come back in order to grasp in our minds the most multidimensional shapes of data sets. And the kicker is that for us, this process has become largely, if not totally, unconscious. That we do it, but we do it well because we no longer think about what we're doing when we do it. And if reading books is going to work for you, both here in the university and later in life, you need to consciously do what we Machiavelli types do largely unconsciously. And universities are good settings for that to happen. Berkeley's high reputation as a place to go to university is deserved. Not only are universities good settings, but we're a great settings. But our success is more the result of institutional evolution via a form of natural selection and imitation, rather than the result of conscious design based on accurate analysis, or our conscious understanding of how to actually turn you into active readers. But we do know that active plays the major role. Something you read once, twice, or even 3 times, and then do not do anything else with your brain. Your brain will take that information, decide it's not important, and dump it with its connections in order to free up capacity in your neurochemistry, electroneurochemistry, for more important things, like the wardrobes of the Kardashians or the technical specifications of Imperial Star Destroyers, or the phone number 202-362-4541 for my best friend back in 2nd grade. So be active when you read. Talk, write, think about this materials, even if you are by yourself, perhaps especially if you are by yourself, rather than just passively listening or even reviewing. If you just skim, say, Dasgupta Economics, a very short introduction, you will then forget it. And so you'll have wasted an hour and a half. Information we do not use and reuse is classified as irrelevant and dumped. So try, when you read the books we assign, to do consciously what I do largely unconsciously when I read. I'm very rarely just reading. I'm analyzing, compressing, synthesizing, summarizing. I am thinking that passage reminded me of something, and then I am turning away to find out what it reminded me of, using the internet to refresh my recollections. I am constantly checking sources and references. That I can do so now is the glory of the internet, and I make maximum use of it. Is this author properly quoting that one? What is the real context of that quotation? Is it, even if it wasn't the intended meaning, is it a valid meaning? And taking notes, but always brief synthesizing notes. Copying down long passages is no good. Asking yourself questions, then answering them with respect to what the readings mean and jotting down key phrases. I find that it was good. How confident are we that your learning to read actively will be of great benefit? I think we are very confident because we have reached this conclusion by thinking about the history of the university and of the book. You see, books used to be very expensive, and the university took form back when they were. And yet, then books became very cheap, and the university survived the coming of printing and cheap books. And it would not have, had not active reading been a very difficult thing to do, had not active reading been of overwhelming importance in actually getting things out of books, and had not the in-person university continued to be an extraordinarily valuable aid, crutch, reinforcer for those who found it difficult, to read actively. So let me back up 2,000 years. Back then, when the very first things, well, we didn't really call them universities, got their start. Universities, so-called, got their start only 1,000 years ago. But back then, 2,000 years ago, even 1,000 years ago, even 600 years ago, books were really, really expensive because they had to be inscribed by hand, letter by letter, using expensive raw materials by highly skilled and literate people with good handwriting, who were rare in society. We have a comprehensive record of prices, or maybe what it was thought prices ought to be, 1,700 years ago from an edict issued in the year 301 by the man who stabilized the refounded Roman Empire and gave it more centuries of life. A military commander born Gaius Valerius Diocles, who, when he became emperor, thought that last sounded too Greek, while it was a Roman Empire, and so became the Roman Emperor Diocletian. Imperator Caesar Gaius Aurelius Valerius Diocletianus Augustus. Lived from 244 to 311, ruled from 286 to 305, and in 305 he decided he might as well retire and let other people take it on it because the job was difficult and he had other things he wanted to do. In Diocletian's price edict, he limited how much a scribe could charge, or perhaps he limited how much the army would pay, it's not quite clear to me, for producing a copy of a book. You would pay a scribe 25 denarii, a denarius being a coin of the time, for 100 lines. What is the context? The context is that a 2-pound of loaf costs 13 denarii, and to hire an unskilled worker for the day costs 36 denarii. Think of that the cost of bread is 1/3 of, well, the cost of enough bread to keep someone largely alive is the cost 1/3 of the wages that they earn during a day. A cheap book, the kind of thing you could get for, say, $10 today, thus cost the same as 440 pounds of bread, or 70 days' work at minimum wage. Compare today, when the cheap book costs the same as 5 pounds of bread, or 60 minutes' work, right, at minimum wage. 40 minutes' work at minimum wage, now that we've raised the minimum wage here in California. With books so expensive, how then did you get educated unless you were already very rich to start with and could afford a large library? And probably a librarian as well. Right? The Roman politician Marcus Tullius Cicero, he was rich. His father gave him the money to buy a library. He supposedly had the best library in Rome in the years between -70 and -30. But his library came with a slave secretary, Marcus Tullius Tiro, who greatly outlived his master and in fact wrote a famous biography of him, which we have now lost. But unless you were super rich, the answer was you had to travel to where the books were if you wanted to get educated. With a cheap book costing the same proportion as the daily wage then, as 70 days times 10 hours a day times $15 an hour, as $10,000 as today, and with expensive, high-quality, durable books costing much more, how many books you needed to read, how many copies, say, of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, how many do you think there were in Western Scotland in 1460? You traveled to the University of Glasgow, brand new. And there you and all the others who wanted to learn about Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics listened to somebody read the book aloud, legate it in a lecture, while you took your notes on it. Because afterwards, your memory and your notes, well, that would be the only contact you would have with Aristotle's ideas. You certainly could not afford to spend the equivalent of $10,000 as a multiple of the daily wage then for anything other than your most favorite books. And that was the origin of the university. Get people who are not super rich together to hear books read aloud. That was how universities got their start back when books were really expensive. They were the only places you could read a few unpopular books in the library and listen to the popular books being read aloud in the lecture. But then in the 1450s comes Johann Gutenberg and the printing press and movable type, and books became really, really cheap. You could have your library and read your books almost anywhere. Machiavelli was not super rich, and yet he had his own library. Books largely created by Aldus Manutius and company, published by him, say the first or second generation of non-super rich people who could have a real personal library. And yet universities did not disappear and lectures did not disappear. They lost their principal purpose of economizing on the number of copies of a book a university needed in order to function, but they became ways of getting people to go over again in their minds what they had read. Structured repetition and dialectic as learning aids of getting people to think actively about the ideas and connect them to things in their own mind, of getting people to engage in dialogues about the ideas, and in mobilizing human group solidarity for the educational process. Indeed, the university did not die after Gutenberg. It flourished more than ever. And at this point, as is traditional at Berkeley, you are allowed to boo if you wish, because my background is now a picture of the Stanford campus, if you did not already know that. So let me recapitulate. The university did not die after Gutenberg made books really, really cheap, even though the university had its origins as a way for society to educate more than a few of the super rich when books were really, really expensive. The university flourished. The university flourished even though a scribe's copying cost of 25 denarii per 100 lines meant a relatively short book cost the same multiple of the pay of a minimum wage worker in California today as $10,000 is. And a high quality long book, maybe 120,000. Back then, before Gutenberg, gathering students in the same place along with the library was the only even faintly cost-effective way for them to read lots of books themselves and listen to books being read aloud and commented on by the lecturer. But with Johann Gutenberg's movable type printing press in the 1400s and thereafter, books became really, really cheap. By the 1800s, books cost 1/100th times as much on the minimum wage scale as in the year 300. The equivalent of not 120,000, but 1,200 in the early 1800s. And today, my oh my, especially if we count the virtual books we have on our devices. Yet the university, even though its fundamental reason for being was gone, you could now curl up with lots of good books anywhere cheaply. Not only survived, yet the university flourished. Why? Andy Matuschak's short essay, Why Books Don't Work, proposes an answer. Most people are bad at reading, and so you have to gather them into a university and force them into its social networks and practices in order to make people do the things necessary in terms of active reading to even do a half-assed job of learning from the books they might read and the lectures they might hear. But some people are excellent active readers on their own, and you need to become such.